responsible for administering that legislation is the Minister of Transportation.
Okay. And does CBSA have a presence on this portion on the entrance of the bridge?
Yes. So CBSA, you see the red, looks like a customs officer, a police officer. That's where CBSA has their staff.
Okay, great. And so I wanted to make the map 3D if we can, just to show the elevation, because the bridge actually starts not at the river there, but actually further down in the actual city. So I just wanted to show that. If we can zoom in a little bit. So it looks like the bridge really starts. Well, we can see there now it's going underneath Wyandotte Street. Is that right?
It goes over Wyandotte Street.
Yes.
Right.
And so it looks like part of the bridge is actually going through the city itself, not over water. Is that right?
Correct.
And
so the bridge itself, I mean, people would refer to the bridge as the portion of the structure between the two largest pillars. Everything else is the approach. And so the approach to, you can see the large pillar coming out of the water there. Everything leading up to that pillar is the approach, and you can see the rise in elevation as vehicles get on the bridge. And just north of where the pointer is now, that's the University of Windsor campus. It's directly adjacent to the Ambassador Bridge, and they have about 17,500 students that attend that campus.
And the other side looks to be quite residential, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so if we can zoom back a little bit, yeah, and just move back. So in order to then enter the bridge, drivers would come north on Huron Church Road, and they would enter what we call, is this called a plaza, this area where vehicles would enter to go through customs and go through the border?
So where the pointer is now, you can see if you stayed to the left on that roadway, that would be into the plaza area, past the duty free, and then onto the bridge. And where that pointer was, where the number 3 is, again, if you stayed to the left, you're going to the bridge. To stay to the right, that's how people, a majority of people I would submit, get to the University of Windsor each and every day. So that is one way to get on the Ambassador Bridge. There is a second entrance to the Ambassador Bridge, and that is sort of in the middle of the screen where the yellow dot is right there. There is an entrance point just down, 20 meters or 30 meters. You can turn in and access the bridge that way as well.
Okay, thank you. And my understanding is that the blockade occurred at the intersection of Huron Church Road and College Street. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so let's go to that area. I believe that's where the green cursor is. Is that right? The
Yes.
green dot. Okay, thank you. So, so now with that in mind, we can talk a little bit about the blockade and how it occurred, having a better understanding of the layout of the city and where the bridge is in relation to the rest of the city. So thank you for that. So you had mentioned that the Ambassador Bridge is privately owned, and that's on both sides of the border, correct?
Correct.
And the southern end, the Canadian port of entry, is, as we saw, within the city of Windsor.
That's right.
And my understanding is that there are a few other points of entry, or there are other areas to be able to get to the US side, including a tunnel. Is that right?
Yes, the City of Windsor and the City of Detroit, we respectively own our own halves of the Windsor-Detroit Tunnel. We manage them together, but ownership rests with each municipality.
And what kind of vehicles pass through the tunnel as opposed to through the bridge? Why would one go over into the tunnel versus the bridge?
The tunnel is predominantly just vehicular traffic, passenger cars. Auto haulers can go in the tunnel, but there are weight and height restrictions. The tunnel's 90 plus years old, so there are height and weight restrictions in the tunnel. So the vast majority of truck traffic uses the Ambassador Bridge. Passenger traffic uses the tunnel.
Okay. And my understanding is there's also a ferry between Windsor and Detroit. Is that right?
That's correct. And the ferry is used for hazardous goods. They cannot cross through, they cannot cross over the Ambassador Bridge if they're carrying hazardous goods.
And does any kind of just regular traffic go also on the ferry, or is that exclusively limited to hazardous goods?
It's exclusive to vehicles carrying hazardous goods.
Okay. And I understand there's also a rail tunnel that connects Windsor to Detroit. Is that right?
There is. Yes.
And what kind of traffic goes through the rail tunnel?
I'm not sure in terms of the volume of traffic, but it is not a double stack tunnel, so it limits the type of traffic that can go through, train traffic that can go through.
And is it generally commercial traffic?
Yes.
Now, according to the institutional report that we saw earlier, my understanding is that there are over 2.6 million truck crossings over the bridge, or there were in 2020. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right.
And this is about 28% of all of Canada's truck crossings.
Correct.
And my understanding also is that the bridge handles over $390 million of trade each day. Does that sound right?
Yeah, so the numbers vary, and it really, the estimate is between 300 and 450 million, depending on the day, depending on the season. But that, any way you cut it, it's hundreds of millions of dollars a day. So between 3 and 450 is sort of the rule of thumb.
And the bridge also serves as an important corridor for travel for Windsor residents. Is that right?
It does.
And generally, what kind of day-to-day traffic in terms of residents is going over the bridge?
Well, I would say there really are two kinds. And so living in Windsor, we have the benefit of being a sort of that safe, small city, community in Canada. And then people who live in Windsor in our area often cross for all of the amenities that you would find in a big city, whether that's sports or dining or entertainment. All of that exists in Detroit, just 10 minutes away. But we also have about 6,000 people who cross to go to work. So people who live in our community and cross to work in the greater Detroit area each and every day. And those are, everything from engineers and a whole host of healthcare professionals that continue to cross even during the pandemic.
And now you had mentioned that if there was an accident on the bridge, it would be the Windsor Police Service who would respond to that accident, correct?
If it's on the Canadian side, yes.
Yes. Now, what happens if, for example, someone's trying to cross unlawfully, or there's another type of situation that's not, say, an accident?
Windsor Police, from my understanding, would be the ones that would receive the first call and provide the first response if there's other criminal type of activity.
Does the OPP have any jurisdiction anywhere in Windsor or the bridge, to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge. I would say that the OPP is responsible. When we looked at the map just a few minutes ago, where the 401 meets the EC Row Expressway, the OPP is responsible to patrol effectively the 401, which is in our area as well.
Right, but is the 401 is outside of the city limits, is my understanding. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay. And does the RCMP have any jurisdiction anywhere in Windsor or on the bridge?
Not to my knowledge. They have a presence in Windsor. There's a detachment, but I'm not aware that they have any sort of operational dealings with the Ambassador Bridge per se.
Okay. Now, just going back to the arrival of the convoy that caused the blockade, and to even go further before that time, my understanding is that there were slow roll protests that happened at the end of January. Is that correct?
Correct.
And were you aware of those at the time?
I really wasn't aware of them at the time. They really had no impact, and the chief of the day hadn't mentioned that to me, and so I wasn't aware at the time.
And these were convoys of trucks going up and down Huron Church Road, kind of slowly in a slow manner. Is that your understanding of what that was?
Correct.
Okay.
And as I came to find out, they weren't blocking traffic, so traffic to and from the Ambassador Bridge was still able to move.
Okay, thank you. Now, at the end of January, were you aware of the convoy protest that was happening in Ottawa?
Yes.
And did you have at that time any information to suggest that those protests might impact Windsor?
I had no information myself, and nothing was passed to me at the end of January.
Okay. So when were you first advised that there was potentially a risk of a blockade to the bridge, or that there was maybe a plan to blockade the bridge?
February the 4th.
Okay. So I'm going to take you to WIN 6010. And this is an email dated February 4th. And if we go to the bottom of the first page, yeah, we can see the email is from somebody at CBSA to Carolyn Brown and some other individuals. Who's Carolyn Brown?
Carolyn Brown is a city employee who's responsible for managing the Windsor-Detroit Tunnel, our half.
Your half of the tunnel. Okay, not the bridge, the tunnel.
Correct.
And so she's saying, Mr. Bosnier is saying to her, we have heard of additional slow roll protests in and around Huron Church and the Ambassador Bridge over the next few days. Information on social media also suggests that, quote, if we don't see any change by Monday, we will be shutting down the Windsor border crossing completely, end quote. While there is no information that I have been made aware of regarding protests at the tunnel, if any such blockade occurs at the Ambassador Bridge, we may see an increase in passenger traffic and those commercial vehicles that are able to utilize the tunnel. Okay, so were you made aware of this information at the time?
Not from the folks on this email, but I did receive a call from the chief of police shortly thereafter who told me about the slow roll and the police are monitoring this slow roll through the city of Windsor.
And at that time, was there any discussion about potentially trying to prevent a blockade from occurring?
No, what the chief told me, Chief Mizuno had said that that's when I found out that it was already happening in the days prior to February the 4th, and that everyone had been peaceful, that there had been no blockage of traffic to and from the Ambassador Bridge. And so what the chief told me is that they were monitoring the situation, and she just wanted to let me know.
Okay. And did the city do anything in response to this information?
On this particular time, I wouldn't say on February the 4th, not right away. I mean, what I did when I found out, I sent a text to Minister Mendicino just to let him know that I had received this information so that he was aware, because we were watching, of course, what was happening in Ottawa and elsewhere around the country. And I just passed that up to the minister for his attention.
Okay, so we'll go to those text messages since you've mentioned it. WIN 402295. So these are your text messages to Minister Mendicino, is that right?
Yes.
And so the blue is you, and if we go down, there's some white. The white text is him?
That's correct.
Okay, and if we just go back up a little bit. Hi, I know things are crazy for you. Wanted you to know that police here are prepping for the potential return of truckers and other malcontents next week. It sounds like they may be attempting to block traffic to the Ambassador Bridge. So that's on February 4th. As you mentioned, when it came to your attention that there was a risk of a blockade, correct?
That's correct.
And if we go down, he says, thanks, man. Let's try to connect this. Let's go down a little bit more. This weekend, stay safe. Okay, so it sounds like you knew him from before. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. It's not the first time you're texting him.
No.
Okay. And he mentions to connect that weekend. Did you speak to him prior to the blockade taking hold? So this would be Friday the 4th, so either on the 5th or the 6th?
I don't recall if we spoke on the weekend.
Okay. Now, moving forward to February 6th, my understanding is that there was a risk of a blockade at another location in Sarnia. Is that right?
Yes.
And were you aware of that at the time?
Yes, I was.
And can you tell us a little bit about what that was about, where it was and what was the issue?
Well, we were watching, and the chief had called me as well, but we were also watching social media and traditional media as well, and saw that there was a threat and then a blockage at or around the Blue Water Bridge.
And that's in Sarnia?
Yes.
And do you know how long that lasted or when it got resolved?
I don't recall how long it lasted, but my recollection is it was ended pretty quick.
And did that raise any concerns with respect to the Ambassador Bridge and possible blockades there?
Yes, it did.
So let's move now to February 7th, the day the blockade actually happened. Can you just walk us through that day, what it was like for you, when you found out, and what you did that day?
Well, I'll say leading up to the 7th, there was lots of activity over the weekend because you could feel the temperature rising in terms of comments on social media, what was happening in and around Sarnia. We were watching what was happening in Ottawa, and we know anyone who lives in Windsor knows and appreciates how important the Ambassador Bridge is, not just for our local and regional economies, but also provincially. And so over the weekend, we started making preparations to acquire jersey barriers at the request of police. I had made an effort to secure one of our Transit Windsor buses to put on the, I would say, the other side of customs, on the duty-free side of the tunnel, just in case there was a blockage at the bridge and the tunnel, because there was the thought that you could have the closure of both pieces of infrastructure. And we knew that we had to provide a mechanism to move healthcare workers who lived in Windsor and worked in Detroit. We had to be able to get them through the tunnel, even if their cars could not get through the tunnel. And so we moved a transit bus to the other side, to the duty-free plaza in the tunnel, and then there was work being done to figure out how to move that bus through, because we were still in this COVID restriction period, and there arrived can and all sorts of restrictions crossing back and forth through the international border. So work was going on that front as well. And so everyone was working very well together, dealing with whatever information we had, and trying to provide and prepare for the eventuality in the worst case scenario, which would be the closure of Huron Church Road leading to the Ambassador Bridge.
And ultimately, the tunnel was not blocked. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, so the bus did not need to be used.
It wasn't used, but we made all preparations just in case, because it was imperative that we had access for healthcare workers to get through to the United States.
Okay, so there was a sense that the temperature was increasing, as you say, and then on the 7th, what happened on that day?
Well, on the 7th, we opened our emergency operations center. So that is at one of our fire halls. The chief opened the EOC. There was a meeting, say 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning that day at the EOC, or of the CCG, I should say. And everything was sort of laid out. Here's what we have. Police were on that call. Everyone was briefed on the information that was available at the time. And everyone was on the same page. So preparations were being made if it got worse.
And was there any discussion about doing any kind of actions to prevent a blockade from taking hold? Because it sounds like there was an anticipation that this could happen. It hadn't yet happened. Was there any discussion about trying to prevent it from happening?
There were some efforts by OPP, as I was made aware, up the 401, outside of the boundaries of the city of Windsor, to try and divert truck traffic that may be on the way. But I think it's fair to say that if you know the city of Windsor and anyone who lives in our city, because of the distance from, say, EC Row Expressway, the end of the 401, to the Ambassador Bridge, and we're talking 3 kilometers each way, the number of businesses, the number of homes, the hotels that are built up that require direct access to Huron Church Road, it would be, for all intents and purposes, practically impossible to guarantee with any certainty that you could provide a route for trucks and without having huge disruption to the community, not just the business community, but also the people who live on the west side of the city.
Right, because Huron Church Road does serve as an access point between the east side of the city and the west side. It seems to cut right through the city. Is that right?
It bisects right through. And so you can imagine the Ambassador Bridge, when it was built 90 years ago, that the road, Huron Church Road, was effectively a road with farms on either side back then. And over time, there are still homes whose driveways require access to Huron Church Road. But over time, that's changed. And so again, you have hotels, many hotels and motels. You have lots of businesses, and you have a whole community. In fact, the western side of Huron Church Road is one of the oldest communities in Ontario, going back to the mid 1700s. It's called Sandwich Town at the time. And so it's a lot of history in that area, and a lot of people live there. Not just students that go to the University of Windsor, but a whole host of folks. I mean, there's probably 25,000 people who live on the other side of Huron Church Road, the west side.
Right. And so there was a CCG meeting in the morning, and then what happened after that?
Everyone was just making plans, doing the best they could do to support police as they tried to mobilize everything that they required to provide us support. It was very obvious that if something happened here, it was a police response that would be required.
And do you know at what point the slow roll became a blockade and the blockade took hold?
I don't remember the exact time.
Okay. I'll take you to an email. It may help. WIN 402223. So this is another email. If we go down from CBSA to Ms. Brown, and this is in the morning. Open source information states that a convoy will meet up in Comber, Ontario between 9 and 10 this morning and start heading for the Ambassador Bridge at 10. Info also states that they will only be going to the bridge and the tunnel will be left open for emergencies and emergency vehicles. So this would have been at 10 a.m. Or at 9:44 in any event, the bridge was still not blocked. Did you receive this information? Was this passed on to you?
I don't recall if that was passed on to me or not.
Okay. And
I say that, and I'll tell you, I was talking to the chief of police or the deputy chief probably 5 times a day.
Yeah.
And direct connection with our city manager and the department heads. So there was no lack of sharing of information in Windsor. We were all pretty much on the same page and aware of what was going on and trying to develop and devise a response, and especially try to help police as they needed.
And so I'll take you to WIN 6098. And this is another update from CBSA to Ms. Brown. And if we go down, let's go down. So actually, let's go down all the way. Let's keep going. There it is. So Mr. Boismere says, I have been advised that all lanes at the bridge are closed and negotiations have halted. Protesters have advised that they are staying put and not moving. They appear to be setting up a camp of sorts. Both lanes to and from the bridge are at a standstill. So this is now at 7:18 p.m. So do you recall hearing it sometime in the evening that the blockade had taken hold?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And if I can take you to WIN 402204. Now, this is the CCG meeting that you had mentioned that had happened on February 7th in the morning. Looks like this was the first kind of blockade-specific or convoy-specific CCG meeting that took place. Is that right?
That's correct.
And if we go down, let's keep going to the next page. Yeah, we'll keep going. No, let's go up a little bit more. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, so I'm looking at the part that says we do have a comprehensive plan. Okay, yeah, so at the bottom there, Deputy Belair. Can you tell us who Deputy Belair is?
He is a deputy police chief in the city of Windsor responsible for operations.
Okay, and you already mentioned Chief Mizuno, who's the chief of police, right?
At the time, yes.
At the time. And so Deputy Belair says, okay, we do have a more comprehensive plan and some fallback and negotiation strategies. there is freedom of movement and we do live in a democracy. If it is an aggressive, keep going down, public demonstration, we have incremental steps to take place as we have done our legal homework. Do you recall what the discussion was around this point, what Chief Belair was trying to express here?
My sentiment at the time was that they were doing everything they could to speak with the protesters, to try and find some way to allow a slow roll to continue if that's what folks wanted to do, but to prevent a permanent shutdown of Huron Church Road.
And my understanding is that in this meeting, the police service explained it had a plan in place if the protest worsened, and that in the meeting, preparations were discussed, such as Jersey barriers and mobilizing towing resources. Is that right?
That's correct.
And can you explain a little bit the city's role in securing Jersey barriers?
I'm not sure exactly who did it, but there was a request made. And so likely it would have been our Public Works Department sourcing whatever we had internally as a city. And then where we were deficient in the numbers required, reaching out to adjacent municipalities and trying to procure the Jersey barriers that police had asked for.
And my understanding is that the Ministry of Transportation of Ontario ultimately did provide a significant number of Jersey barriers. Does that accord with your recollection?
Certainly at the end of this incident, we wouldn't have been able to do it without them. We needed their help to secure 3 kilometers of Jersey barriers in each direction. So a total of 6 kilometers of Jersey barriers.
And my understanding is the city was not, did not secure towing capacity or was not able to secure towing capacity. Is that right?
We have police have a contract with a company, which is quite standard, and they provide towing services. And so they had capacity, but there was, also there were threats being made against the company and the owners of the company that if they participated in towed cars, there was all sorts of things going on to sort of attack the company and their reputation online, giving them negative reviews and doing a number of things that happened ultimately. So yes, they are our contractor, they were cooperative, but if the expectation is that they could have helped move all of the vehicles that were there, including some of the heavy trucks, I don't think it would have taken a long time, or they wouldn't have had all of the resources required. We would have needed additional support if any attempt was made to go in and move everyone in any timely manner.
So they didn't refuse to provide services. It's just they were one company and couldn't do all of it, essentially.
Yeah, I'm not aware that they refused to provide services.
Okay. But you are aware that they received some kind of negative, repercussions as a result of assisting.
That's correct.
And my understanding is that originally both the north and the southbound lane of the bridge was blockaded, and then at some point one of the lanes opened up. Do you have a sense for the kind of the movement of the blockade and the different points of entry?
I think police would be better positioned to answer that, but the briefings that I received from the chief at the time is that the ongoing negotiations, they were trying to get a lane open for emergency purposes. And so they were at one time successful in doing that, and then that ended very, very quickly. And part of the issue that we experienced collectively in Windsor is that this was a leaderless movement. There was no one speaking for the group who could guarantee the behavior of the other members. And so police will know better the timing in terms of, the ebb and flow of what they were able to achieve. But the briefings I received from Chief Mizuno was that at one time they did have a lane open, but that agreement dissolved very quickly.
And my understanding too is that the access from Wyandotte Road was open at one time, and then that also became blockaded over time.
Correct.
And when you say a leaderless movement, is this information you received from the police, or how did you come to that conclusion?
Yes, that's information I received from police.
Okay. Now, on the 7th, which is the day of the blockade, I understand you had a discussion with Solicitor General Jones. Is that correct?
In or around the 7th, it was the 7th or the 8th.
Okay. And she asked what Windsor needed to respond to the blockade?
She did. And so obviously the Solicitor General had responsibility for the OPP at the time. And I wanted to make sure that she was informed of what was going on the ground. But my question to the Chief of Police was, Chief, what do you need? How many officers do you need? Because she told me she does not have enough human resources to end the situation that had developed in Windsor. So my question to her was, what do you need? Tell me what you need, and I'll help amplify whatever you need, up the chain with the folks that I speak to. And so she said, I need 100 officers. And so I amplified that with the Solicitor General. I amplified that with the Premier. I amplified that with Minister Mendicino. And then there were conversations later in the evening on the 8th with my Chief of Staff and other Chiefs of Staff at for sure, the federal level. And they asked for that request in writing. And so the Chief in her own right was already working through her channels. And so I asked her, I told her that we're getting the request to put this in writing. Can you please do that? And she did that the next day. And so we received the letter on the 9th. And she sent that letter to asking for 100 officers to the Commissioner of the OPP and the Commissioner of the RCMP. And then we forwarded those letters as well to the folks that we were talking to.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, it started with a discussion between you and the chief. You asked her what she needed. She told you 100. You then went to Solicitor General Jones and to Minister Mendicino and said, we need 100 officers. And they came back and said, please put that in writing. And then you went back to the chief and told her, put it in writing. And on the 9th, these letters went out. Is that a fair summary?
Correct.
Okay. So when you spoke to the Solicitor General on the 7th, that would have been to tell her the request for 100. And is that when she told you I need it in writing?
No, she never told me she needed it in writing. And so I spoke with the Solicitor General just because I wanted her to be aware of what was happening on the ground and make sure that she was informed of what was going on down here. And the same with Minister Mendicino, just here's the temperature and the tenor on the ground. Here's what we're seeing, just so they had a sort of situational awareness, I would call it. And so they didn't ask for it in writing. It was through their staff, really at the federal level, through staff at the federal level who said, can you please put the request in writing? And that was on the evening of the 8th. And then I sent a message to the chief saying, they're asking for this in writing. And she had one of her deputies or superintendents put that in writing, and she sent it off in letter form to the Commissioner of the RCMP and the Commissioner of the OPP. And
on February 8th, that was your chief of staff that participated in that staff meeting. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And do you recall anything else noteworthy from that discussion with the Solicitor General at that time on the 7th?
No, she was obviously very concerned, very interested, very much wanting to help. And, we agreed just to stay in touch and make sure that we were informing one another of important things related to the matter.
And in terms of your discussion with Minister Mendicino that same day, was it similar kind of tenor? Is that essentially the same type of discussion?
Exactly.
Okay. Now, on February 8th, there was also a meeting of the Windsor Police Services Board, correct?
That's correct.
And that was an in-camera meeting, is my understanding. Do you recall that meeting?
Yes.
So I'll take you to the minutes of that meeting, WIN 401999. Okay, and if we go down. Oh, sorry, I think this was actually your request to call the meeting.
Yes.
So you called this meeting as chair, correct?
Sarah Sabihoudin is our board assistant. And so I had asked her to call a meeting of the board. I think I did it. If you went down even further, I think I asked around noon on the 8th.
So, and the minutes of that meeting are actually at WIN 402174. Okay, yeah, there we go. So it was on February 8 at 7 p.m. And we can see the chief was there, 2 deputy chiefs, you were there as well. Some counselors were there and others. And if we go down to, I believe it's, oh, there we go. Chief Mizuno provided an update to the WPS board on the recent situation regarding the Ambassador Bridge blockade. WPS was notified last week of the potential for this protest to take place in Windsor. And then if we go to the end of that page, WPS has requested assistance should we need it from Chatham Police and LaSalle Police. Our top concerns are public safety and de-escalation. What was the board's role with respect to securing resources from other local police forces?
The board took no role in that directly. The board, and I think you see in the minutes, was Chief, do you have the resources required to deal with the situation? What do you need from us? If you don't have the resources, what do you need us to authorize in terms of budget or whatever was in our purview to assist with the chief providing the response that was required?
And did the WPS request any assistance from the board at this meeting?
No.
Okay. And if we go down, keep going. Chief Mizuno there in the middle says, WPS officers are doing a fantastic job. Lessons have been learned from Ottawa and from our own past experiences, and external assistance has been requested. Do you know what the chief meant from when she says lessons have been learned from Ottawa? Do you know what those lessons are?
In my conversations with the chief, the largest lesson learned was not to let this grow. Don't let bouncy castles and hot tubs and sort of those types of amenities come to the streets on Huron Church Road and allow this to grow. So make sure that we're dealing with this, as quickly and swiftly and professionally in a way that, as she said, provides for public safety and de-escalates. But don't, lessons from Ottawa don't allow this to grow. There may have been others that were on her mind, but that's one that she mentioned to me.
And are you aware whether there were actions taken to contain it so that it wouldn't grow?
Police did take action with respect to Jersey barriers, and so they cordoned off certain streets, and they had control of certain areas that I think made their life a little easier and was able to prevent the situation from getting larger. And
in terms of the request for 100 officers, do you have a sense, or did the board have a sense for how that number was conceived?
No idea. It was simply a request of the chief. What do you need? Recognizing that they had already on the weekend, say of the 4th, 5th, 6th, leading up to this, already put a request in for some public liaison officers from the OPP. And so she was already doing what was required to ask for resources that we may not have had that would have helped provide for what she's saying here, de-escalation, public safety. It was only when it was finally cemented, the situation finally cemented itself and it became a permanent blockade, she had told me, I don't have everything I need. We won't be able to resolve this with the human resources that we have inside the Windsor Police Service. We're going to need additional help. To which my question was, what do you need? How many officers do you need? You tell me, and I will help amplify that, at the political level so that they are aware of what our request is. And of course, the expectation is that she was going to do what she needed to do through the OPP and the proper channels operationally on her side.
Right. And in terms of an operational plan, did the board ever see how those officers were going to be used?
No.
Okay. Did the board ever request to see an operational plan?
No, and I think that would be somewhat unusual for at least for our board. We wouldn't get into that level of detail. And none was presented and none was asked for.
Okay. And are you aware whether those resources requested were ultimately provided?
I think it's fair to say more than what was requested was actually provided. And so my understanding, at the sort of in the final analysis is that we asked for 100. One may look at the fact that the chief wrote one letter to the RCMP and one letter to the OPP and may say, well, in fact, you asked for 200. Even if you look at 200 as, if you look at it from that perspective and you say we asked for 200, it's my understanding that we had at least 500 officers attend to deal with the situation.
And when you say you were amplifying the request politically, what was the response that you were getting from the federal government and from the provincial government?
A desire and willingness to help. There were great lines of communication with Sylvia Jones, great lines of communication with the Premier. Minister Mendocino was excellent, and a great phone call with the Prime Minister that I had that, he was very understanding, and of course, living through the situation here in the Ottawa, had a perspective on what we were dealing with and wanted to help. So all lines of communication were open, and it was back and forth. So it was very good.
And did the board take any specific actions to support the WPS during this time?
No, the board asked the chief, what do you need from us? And her comment effectively was, we have everything we need, or it's being worked on at this point. There was no direction required from the board that wasn't already being worked on. So
it was the board's understanding on February 8th that the only thing preventing the blockade from being dismantled was the influx of resources. There was a plan in place, and they were just waiting for the resources?
Correct.
Did the board adopt any policies pursuant to Section 31 of the Police Services Act with respect to either the slow roll or the blockade?
No.
Did the board ever direct the police chief in any way as contemplated in the Police Services Act?
No.
And who was advising the board on these issues, on legal issues and interpretations of the act, et cetera?
We didn't have legal counsel in these meetings. And so you'll see we had in this particular meeting, we had the entire board. We had the chief, Deputy Chief Belair at the time was there. We had our provincial police liaison person from the Solicitor General's office there as well, Dave Tilley. And so it never got to a point where the board felt like or asked a question that couldn't be answered or was unsatisfied in some way. So the board felt satisfied at the end of this meeting that they had asked the appropriate questions of our chief and were supporting her in every way that she asked.
Now, are you aware of whether the WPS had any communications with protesters or blockade organizers?
The chief did tell me that police continued to talk to protesters. Again, I go back to, opening one lane for a period of time that was through a negotiation. And every day, the chief told me that they continue to talk, they continue to have discussion and dialogue. It just, ultimately didn't change much.
Did you have any discussions with protesters or organizers?
No.
Okay. Do you have a sense for whether the protesters were local to Windsor, whether they were coming from the outside, whether they were coming from Ottawa? Do you have a sense for who these people were?
I asked the question because clearly police were gathering intelligence on license plates and, scanning social media and doing the work that they needed to do. And I asked the question on whether or not these were, they generally local folks or were they folks coming, from elsewhere? And there were a fair number of local folks, as I was told, that were part of the demonstrating group. But I was also told by the chief that there were a fair number of folks who weren't even from Essex County that had come in from elsewhere to participate in this.
Now, on February 9th, you said to reporters that arresting the demonstrators opposed to pandemic health measures and towing their vehicles could lead to violence. And because you said some of them were willing to die for it. Do you recall saying that?
I do.
And how did you reach that assessment that they were willing to die for it?
Well, there was a TV report that was also reported on the front page of the Windsor Star, and it was very early on in the protests that one of the protesters had said outright that this is a cause that they were willing to die for. And there was the reports to me was that there was a very high temperature on the ground amongst the protesters. They were very aggressive in their language and in their posture. And it was that type of comment, willing to die for the cause, that caused police to take a more measured approach into the way that they dealt with the situation. No one need to die on the streets of Windsor or elsewhere protesting vaccine mandates or whatever the protest ultimately was about. And so everyone took a pause. No one wanted to see a repeat. You know, that was one thing the chief had told me, that there was a concern about what had happened in Toronto at the G20. And so, you know, members of the public in Windsor were saying, why don't you just go in there and end this? Like, it didn't seem like it wasn't something that it was an issue that the police couldn't resolve quickly to the average person. And so the public was feeling, you know, the energy that they wanted to see something happen. And at the same time, you know, police are saying this is not, you know, a typical protest that you would see on a Sunday afternoon on the front lawn at City Hall. And so they were being very measured. They were being very cautious. They did not want to see a recreation of the events that happened in Toronto. And so they were taking a lot of precaution.
And do you have a sense for how many vehicles or number of protesters were involved?
It seemed to ebb and flow. And so sometimes at night, more would come out as I'm told the party atmosphere sort of ramped up. And it could be 200 at one point, you know, down to 75.
Sorry, are you referring to protesters or vehicles? Okay.
Protesters. Sorry, was that your question?
Yes,
Okay.
protesters and vehicles.
Yeah, and vehicles, I'll leave it to Deputy Chief Crowley to answer that. I'm not exactly sure how many vehicles ultimately were there.
Okay. And so, so then is it fair to say that bylaw was not ticketing and towing? They were not enforcing because of the reasons you mentioned in terms of escalating?
Yeah, we would never, with the temperature on the ground and the statements folks were making, we would never send our bylaw officers in to enforce municipal bylaws. In fact, you know, there was a report to me that we had our parking enforcement is outsourced to the commissionaires. And a commissionaire did respond February 8th or 9th, went in to issue some tickets and was swarmed and put in a situation that was, she felt was very dangerous, or that they felt was very dangerous, and actually had to be escorted to their car by police and leave, you know, and folks were spitting on the car as the commissionaire left. And so the temperature was too hot to think that you were going to send municipal bylaw officers in there without police accompanying them. And so at the end of the day, the thought was that negotiation would be the best way forward. And again, no one need to die or get hurt in this type of protest. Let's find a sensible way through and get everyone to move on so we can get the bridge open and the economy moving again.
Right. And are you aware of any other incidences of threats or violence with respect to the blockade, aside from the one you just mentioned?
Well, related to the blockade, besides
Yes.
the one at my house.
Well, maybe tell us about that one.
Well, one of the folks involved threatened to, I think it was to bomb my house or do something like that. And so, you know, we woke up and all of a sudden there are 2 or 3 police cars around our house for several weeks because of the temperature on the ground and what people were posting on social media and the comments that were being made. It became a very direct threat to me and my family. And so that in itself was concerning. But it was the nature and sort of the spirit of the protest. It was unlike anything I've ever seen. You know, I've lived my whole life in the city of Windsor. It's unlike anything I've ever seen during that time. And the posture and the language was, you know, it was almost as if folks wanted some sort of brawl on the streets. You know, they were hoping police would engage in that way so they could have some sort of, you know, brawl on the streets, if I can describe it that way. And I know police weren't interested in that. As the mayor, I wasn't interested in that. As chair of the police board, I wasn't interested in that. We were interested in finding a way through this that was sensible, that was practical, but ultimately that you know, opened the road leading to the Ambassador Bridge, because it is such a vital economic piece of economic infrastructure, not just for Windsor, Essex County, but for the entire province and respectfully for the nation. We had to get that roadway open.
And are you aware of any other individuals who received threats? Anyone within city council, anyone within, in any other kind of prominent position?
I know Councillor Fabio Costante, who represents the west side of the city, on both sides, frankly, of Huron Church Road. And there was a comment made that they would protest at his law office. He's a lawyer and he has a law office in Sandwich Town. And so there was a comment made that they would be going there to protest at the law office.
Did that materialize?
Not that I'm aware of.
So I want to go back to the request for resources, if I can, for a minute. Can I take you to WIN 401623? And these are the letters that Chief Mizuno sent. I believe this one is to the Minister of Emergency Preparedness. There we go, to Minister Blair, and that's on February 9. And I just want to go down. Yeah, here we go. So it says Windsor Police Service is requesting a minimum of 100 police officers be dispatched to the city of Windsor to bolster current and potentially future requirements. Okay, and if we go down, just want to see the signature. Yep, Pamela Mizuno, Chief of Police. Thank you. So that's the letter that she sent to Minister Blair.
Yes.
And if we go to WIN 401648. So this is now also dated February 9, addressed to the Honorable Sylvia Jones, Solicitor General. And if we go down, I believe, so this one is also requesting 100 police officers. I believe it's the same letter. The letters were also asking in the second paragraph, marked police vehicles and tow trucks, including heavy tows for large transport vehicles. And if we go down, it's also from Chief Mizuno. Now, you had mentioned that your understanding was that the requests were made to the RCMP and the OPP. Are you aware of other letters that were sent to the commissioners of the OPP and RCMP?
No.
Okay, so these would be the requests, the letters that were sent.
Those are the letters that I'm aware of.
Okay.
If the chief, I know, was having conversations with her colleagues that I wasn't, that I wasn't party to. But this is what we were asked for, to put it in writing, and that's what she did. And she sent it off from her office to Minister Blair's office and to Minister Jones's office.
Okay, and on February 9, that same day, your chief of staff scheduled a meeting between you and the Office of the Solicitor General. Do you recall that? I know we had a discussion on the 7th or the 8th, and now it looks like there's another one on the 9th. What was the purpose of that discussion?
It was just an update. And so, I was just trying to keep everyone updated.
Was anything requested at that time or offered in terms of assistance?
Nothing more than the 100 officers that we had asked for.
Okay. And if we can go to WIN 401583. So this is now text messages between you and Premier Doug Ford, is that right?
Correct.
And so the dark is you speaking, and then the light colored text is Premier Ford, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And it looks like he is asking you to call him on February 9. Did you have a call with him on February 9?
I did.
And what was the discussion on that call?
Obviously, he was receiving, I shouldn't say obviously, but he was receiving phone calls from businesses as well who were concerned about the blockade at the Ambassador Bridge. I gave him sort of a situational briefing on what we had going on down here, and that we had asked for 100 officers. So it was I think a fairly quick phone call, just a couple of minutes. And, he was stressing to me the importance of the Ambassador Bridge, and that we have to find a way to get this open. And I certainly agreed with him and understood that as well.
Did he make any offers of assistance or anything of that nature?
No, I had told the Premier that we asked for 100 officers and that OPP already had some resources on the ground, PLT, liaison teams, that were already here.
Yeah.
So I told him that and told him about the 100 officer request. And then he asked for Minister Mendicino's phone number, which I texted to him.
And now this is 2 days before the province declared a provincial state of emergency. Did that come up in your discussions with him?
Never, no,
So he didn't ask you whether you wanted that or whether you needed that or anything to that effect?
no.
What about the Emergencies Act, the Federal Emergencies Act? Was that ever discussed with the Premier?
Never.
Now, the next day on February 10, you spoke to the media and said that additional resources were being deployed by the OPP and that the Premier and Solicitor General were responding rapidly to your call for support. Was that accurate at the time?
I'm sorry, can you ask?
It was on February 10. You
Yeah.
told reporters that this request was being actioned very quickly and that the OPP was being deployed and that the Premier and Solicitor General were responding rapidly to your request for resources.
I believe that to be true, yes.
Okay. And do you have a sense for when it says there OPP resources started to arrive? So by the 10th, you were receiving, or the city was receiving OPP resources?
Yes, we had some resources, cars that you could see, OPP cars along the Huron Church Road. And the chief told me that there were PLT units that were already here negotiating. And then she did tell me that public order units were also starting to arrive.
Because my understanding is that the Windsor Police Service did not have at the time a PLT unit or a POU unit. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So they were coming in from other, the OPP was providing those, is that right?
Yes, OPP, RCMP.
Do you have a sense for when our RCMP officers arrived in Windsor?
I don't exactly know.
Did the board have any role in swearing RCMP officers in?
No.
Do you know how that was done or who did that?
I just was aware that that was an issue, and I'm not sure the mechanics behind the scenes on how that was resolved.
Now, my understanding is that there was an injunction that was sought and granted with respect to the blockade, correct?
Correct.
And how did this idea come about? Who was the initiator of this?
Well, I was, and on February the 9th, in sort of the mid to late afternoon, I'd had a conversation with our Commissioner of Legal Services, Shelby Askin-Hager, about the prospect of an injunction. And she wanted to think through it and make sure she understood the best way to move forward with that idea. And then on the 10th in the morning, we had to move quickly if we were going to make that happen. And so I said, we need to do this. And the reason for doing this was, there were multiple reasons. What people need to appreciate is that not just the temperature on the ground of the protesters, but the temperature of the general public to this protest was amplifying as well. And I could not, as mayor, I could not, as chair of the Windsor Police Services Board, direct police operations and tell the chief or the police administration how to move forward and when to move forward. I had no clear line of sight on how many resources were coming here. I knew there, I'm getting dribs and drabs of, yes, some folks are en route. Well, are they en route from Alberta? Are they en route from Newfoundland? Are they coming from Aurelia? I have no sense of the timing. And so the public temperature to this protest was also growing rapidly, to the point where you had Facebook groups being set up where people wanted to go out and undertake sort of vigilante type justice on the streets to remove these protesters themselves. And it was, as it relates to, the pandemic that we'd all lived through, in Windsor, we had lived through the same thing that many others have lived through, the stops and the starts of businesses, people not getting paid for a period of time, and going through that frustration and friction as we've all dealt with the pandemic collectively. And so just when we were at a point where there seemed to be, light on the horizon, this was seen to be very, how do I say it, assaultive to many people in Windsor that this was a small group of people, a relatively small group of people who are now going to jeopardize their employment. And so you had, like I said, Facebook groups that were starting where people were suggesting and union leadership suggesting they were prepared to help move the protesters themselves and take action themselves. And so part of the reason for applying for the injunction was to send a signal to the public that I'm doing everything, that the city is doing everything, that city council is doing everything we can from our side of the table to try and resolve this issue. It was really the only positive step I could think of taking that would be helpful in terms of a signal to the public. Before I did this, I did talk to the chief and said, would this be helpful to you? And she said, listen, it won't hurt. And so on the morning of the 10th, very early, we activated legal teams to start putting the materials together, trying to see if we could get a scheduled appointment in court to present the application. And I worked with our Commissioner of Legal Services and our city manager and all of the right people on the city side to see that move forward very quickly. And so, you know, the conversation really was first thing in the morning, 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and by 2 o'clock we were appearing in front of Justice Morwitz to have this discussion.
Right. So I'll
And I would just say,
yes,
so the one part was the public, letting the public know we're doing everything we can. The other thing was putting, you know, another arrow in the quiver for police. It was another tool that they could use with respect to saying you are now in violation. If we were successful in getting the injunction, that you were in violation of this injunction, and it was another arrow in their quiver.
And so City Council adopted a resolution that an injunction be sought, right?
Correct.
And this was on February 10.
That's right.
So you were able to call a meeting that quickly to get everybody together from the 9th when you kind of conceived this to the 10th.
That's right.
And it seems like the police was on board with the injunction. They thought it wouldn't hurt in any event.
Wouldn't hurt.
And so ultimately, as you say, the injunction became effective at 7 p.m. on February 11, is my understanding. Is that right?
That's correct.
And why was the city an intervener in that application and not the main applicant? Do you know?
I think through our discussions before we proceeded, we talked about who was most impacted, you know, and how could we tell the story here about who was impacted. And it was clear in the first 60 minutes of Huron Church Road being blocked, our phone rang at the mayor's office from our largest employer, Chrysler, or now Stellantis, to say what's going on at the Ambassador Bridge. You know, there are 5,000 people directly who work in that facility making Chrysler Pacificas and minivans that rely on smooth and efficient border crossings because the whole industry, the whole auto industry works on a just-in-time basis. There's no parts being stored on site. They are brought in and that bridge is moving and the material is moving across that bridge every hour of every day. And so it's you know, for perspective, the average part that goes into a car that rolls off the assembly line at the end of the manufacturing process, those parts have crossed the border on average 6 to 7 times, back and forth, Detroit, back to Windsor, you know, as they continue to be, you know, upgraded and built. And so within the first 60 minutes, they called and said, what's going on at the Ambassador Bridge? And so we knew that the APMA, the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, the CVMA, the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, were impacted dramatically by the activity at the bridge. And so they were certainly, you know, good parties to put forward the request. And then we took the role, we played the role that we played, I think, appropriately.
And so my understanding is the Attorney General of Ontario was also an intervener in that application.
That's correct.
And how did they become involved and what was the coordination with them like?
I'm not sure.
Okay, who took the lead on the injunction from the city's side?
Shelby Askenhager, who's our Commissioner of Legal Services.
Okay, so she would have had the coordination with the Attorney General, is that right?
She would be the one in the best position to answer your question.
Okay, fair enough. So as we said, on February 11 at 7 p.m., the injunction came into effect. It was extended then on February 18, is that right?
That's correct.
And what, if anything, did it change on the ground? What impact did it have, if any?
Well, I think that once the injunction became effective, that it sent a signal to the public that this has now, from the public watching from the outside, that we have done all that we can do. And again, it gave another tool to police to go in, and they did. When the police went in and actually had to arrest people, those folks were charged with violating the terms of the injunction. And so it sent a signal, but I think, I would like to think that from a protester's perspective, it also meant that the protesters had their day in court, had the opportunity to present their position to Justice Morowitz, Chief Justice Morowitz, and have a conversation in court through the established legal structures that we have in place. All parties had a chance to do that. And Chief Justice Morowitz ultimately made his decision that was favorable to grant the injunction. But everybody had an opportunity. In fact, our application on February 10th was delayed and heard on February 11th to ensure that all parties, including the protesters, were given notice so that they could participate. Police went out and plastered every telephone pole, the Jersey barriers with copies of the order. We had to set up a website. We promoted it on social media. Certainly it was amplified in every major media source and through every social media channel that I saw.
If you could just slow down a bit
Sure.
for the interpreters.
Thank you. That there were great efforts made to make sure that all parties who had an interest in this application had an opportunity to have their day in court.
And the city, in fact, assisted to distribute these pamphlets once the injunction was granted to give notice of the injunction. Is that right?
Correct.
So would you say there was adequate notice given about the injunction to those in the blockade and in the protest area?
Absolutely.
Did it have the effect of having people leave? Did anybody leave as a result of the injunction, or was it simply that then they were charged with violating the injunction once the arrest took place?
The reports, I wasn't on the ground, but the reports that came back to me is that many of the protesters were looking at this as, another court order, another law, another thing that just, was dispensable. They could violate it. It was no big deal. It was just words on a paper. And so I'm not sure that it had, on the face of it, I'm not sure that it had the effect of having people say, oh, there's a court order, I'm going to leave now. I think it just, gave them, the protesters, another thing to rally behind, saying nothing's going to make us leave.
Now, was there any discussion with the Windsor Police Service about whether they had the resources at that time to enforce the injunction and whether that was a concern at all?
Well, I think it's fair to say as we got to, that was a Friday, the 11th, as we got to the Friday, all of the communication from the chief to myself was that we had major resources that were here on the ground, and the plans were devised and being, sorted out with the help of the OPP commander and our own incident commanders. Everyone was working through how to effect a resolution to this blockade. So
fair to say that the injunction and the resources were coming at the same time, essentially.
Exactly.
There was also a board meeting, a special in-camera board meeting on February 11th. Do you recall that?
Yes.
So that was the second board meeting with respect to this blockade. And I'm going to take you to the minutes, WIN 402173. Yeah, and if we go down, if we keep going down. Okay, and yeah, keep going down a little bit. There's a part where you ask a question. I'm just trying to find that. Keep going down. Okay, let's go back to the first page. Oh, there it is. Chair, Mayor Dilkins, is there anything required from WPS from the board? Chief Mizuno, no other resources required at this time. We initiated OPP resources Wednesday. Additional resources are flowing in. RCMP have come to town as well and are helping. So this lines up with what you're telling me. By the 11th of February, it sounds like resources have been mobilized, they're starting to come in, and there's no real concern over resources anymore. Is that right?
Correct.
And if we go down a little bit more. So Chief Mizuno there says, if and when we take action, we will be well positioned with resources to support that. State of emergency does help and gives us additional tools in terms of future protests. Now, this is on February 11. I assume she's referring to the provincial state of emergency, correct?
That's correct.
And do you have a sense for what those tools were that the provincial state of emergency could assist with?
I don't recall the entire list, but I knew that there were significant financial penalties. And the province, through their emergency action, also sent a very strong signal that if you continue to participate in these protests, that at these locations or border crossings, that you could lose, if you were a truck driver, your commercial vehicle operating license. And you could also lose your driving license if you were, just not a truck driver. And so those are pretty significant penalties that I think sent a signal to any reasonable or sensible person to say, we better think long and hard about wanting to continue the protest at this location, because the disincentive is huge.
Right, and do you have any sense for whether that provincial state of emergency encouraged protesters to leave the site?
I think that provincial emergency, when the police were ready to move, and they did the next day and ultimately cleared it up 2 days after this meeting, that you had compliance when the Jersey barriers were moved, when the police put their line in place and they started moving forward with their line, and they got to the point where there are vehicles there, the vast majority of people ultimately left.
Now, I want to go back to your discussions with the Minister of Public Safety, Minister Mendicino, at WIN 402295. And these are the text messages that we had seen before. And if we can go to page 3. So you say, I told Premier I spoke to you and he asked for your number. I get the sense he is going to follow Alberta and Saskatchewan. What did you mean by that?
The Premier, I think appropriately, was feeling the temperature across the province, was seeing these protests probably in Ottawa, but certainly in Windsor as an outlet for some who wanted some of the restrictions to be lifted. And, Alberta and Saskatchewan had moved to start lifting some of the restrictions. And my sense from the Premier is that he wanted to find a pathway to get back to normal, as soon as it made sense as well.
And did you have a sense that that was because of the protests across Ontario?
No, not necessarily. I think my sense from the conversation is that, again, he had his finger on the pulse of the people in Ontario and was watching, of course, what was happening across the country as well, and was feeling, some of the frustration that we were all feeling with respect to the lockdowns, recognizing that, it was January of 2022 where we were in a lockdown as well, right. Provincial lockdown. So the Premier sensibly was echoing some of the sentiments and looking at this as, a percentage of the population who was protesting because they felt most aggrieved by this.
And if we go to page 9, go down. You say, I'm told our police support is going to be good. I think protesters are looking to make show of things. So in terms of the police support going to be good, was that from your discussions with Chief Mizuno?
Yes.
Um,
Well, I should say Chief Mizuno and Deputy Chief at the time, Belair.
Belair, okay, thank you. And my understanding is you texted, once the injunction was granted, you texted the minister as well as Deputy Premier Jones and the Premier to let them know that the injunction had been granted.
Correct.
Right. Okay. And if we go to page 12 of this document, okay, and he says, do you think it will end today? And you're saying, I'm thinking it will. So what was your sense on February 12th of where things were at in terms of resources and a plan to move forward to clear the blockade?
That everything was in place, that the resources were in Windsor, that the plan had been devised, and in fact, on the 12th, the police started their operation. They put out the line with public order units and all of the equipment behind them, and they started to move forward on the 12th to deal with the situation on the ground.
And in the text above, you mention the congregation from Harvest Bible Church. My understanding is they had something to do with continuing the blockade at some point on the 12th. Can you explain that situation?
So the picture above my words, I think, is a link or a screenshot from the pastor at the time. I'm not sure if he still is, but as the police started to move forward and, you know, make advances on the 12th, there was a call put out by the pastor at this church to ask for folks to come down and support the protesters. And very quickly, which might have been, you know, 100 to 200 people turned into 600 people, including parents with kids and strollers. Like it was almost unbelievable how fast that situation grew in terms of the number of people. But seeing the police action, I mean, it was disheartening to see the police action and them making advances, and then to see parents bringing their kids down to that situation. And that's exactly what happened, which is largely why it wasn't resolved that particular day on Saturday. It took until Sunday for the situation to be resolved.
I see. So the police started moving in on the 12th and weren't able to because now the number of protesters grew in size.
Well, and I think someone in the police structure, probably several people, said this would be, you know, the most sensible thing here is to wait, because at some point these kids are going to get cold. It's February. They're going to get cold. They're going to get tired. They're going to get hungry, and they're going to, you know, they're going to leave. So we're not going to move forward with the policing posture they had in place when you had a lot of young kids there. They were being very wise in their approach and saying, let's do this at a different time when it makes more sense.
And if we go to page 12 of this, oh, we are on page 12. Okay, keep going down, please. Keep going down. Okay, so you say it will end today, fingers crossed. Police have full control of the area now, and this is now on the 13th, correct?
Yes.
Good. Bridge reopened today. If so, it will be later once Jersey barriers, et cetera, are removed. There is still some activity in the plaza at, I can't really read that.
Tecumseh and Huron
Tecumseh and
Church.
Huron Church. Police just got permission from owner to trespass these people. Stay tuned. Okay, keep me posted. Headed into meetings with the PM. And if we go to page 18. So this is now 3:40 PM on the 13th, and he says about to head into meeting with PM. Any critical updates? And you say small flare up, a block from Huron Church, a few arrests made, simultaneously working to get Huron Church open. 25 to 30 malcontents on scene. Keep going down. Update about 25 arrests now. Police hoping to reopen bridge tonight, trying to secure 1,100 Jersey barriers, failing which one side of Huron Church will reopen and operate for two-way traffic like a construction zone. And if we go down, and then it looks like then on the 13th, that's when the bridge reopened, is my understanding, or the blockade was cleared on the 13th, right?
Correct.
And then on the following day, he asks, how's it going this AM on the 14th in the morning? Smooth so far. And then you say, are you guys taking some legislative action re-emergencies act? And then he says, we'll call you this afternoon. To the extent you can be supportive of any additional authorities that gets Windsor the resources you need to keep the bridge open, people safe, that would be great. So I want to ask you about that exchange. What gave you the sense that there was some consideration of the Emergencies Act being considered at that time?
I had seen a report, and I don't know which media source, CTV or CBC or Globe and Mail had made some post that I saw that proposed that may be in the works. And so it just caused me to send him the question.
And he said he would call you about that. And he didn't respond over text, but he said he would call you. And did you have a discussion?
I don't know, we did not.
Oh, you didn't?
No.
Okay. And then what did you understand him to mean when he says, to the extent you can be supportive of any additional authorities?
Well, I think, we all know that act has never been used before. And we all know that it's a serious act and requires this type of thing to happen afterwards, which is extraordinary. And so if they were going to move forward with that, I think he's saying, if you could express, the way I took that is if you could express what was happening on the ground that would help justify this, that would be helpful to us. And I think it's really, really important, to reflect on that statement, but also use that statement based on what we were seeing on the ground in Windsor. And so there may have been some great relief. There was great relief to a lot of people in Windsor on the 13th. Once the folks were moved, all of a sudden, in lightning speed, 1,100 Jersey barriers were replaced, 6 kilometers of Jersey barriers, creating a direct pipeline from the 401 to the Ambassador Bridge. But the piece that needs to be explained here is the heightened state of alert that was in place by police in the community and the city with respect to some sort of recidivism that may happen as a result of this blockade being moved. And it's the type of behavior that's happened throughout the pandemic, where you have members of the public in Windsor saying, there's a protest, we're all supposed to be masked and meters apart from one another, and there's a protest and 100 people down, by our great Canadian flag at the waterfront. Why aren't police doing anything? Why is that behavior being allowed to continue? And it's hard to explain to people that if you move 100 people out and take action against these 100 sort of lawbreakers or rule breakers, that you could have 3,000 the next weekend. You become the rallying cry for this. And so that was the thought in place here from a police perspective. It's conversations that we certainly had amongst many of the senior staff and myself at the city is, this action needs to be resolved. This action needs to be taken to resolve the situation on the ground. But what happens after they're gone? And so the number of police that were sent to the city of Windsor to move the protesters out was one thing, but a significant number of police resources remained in order to make sure that this didn't flare up again. And so from an Emergencies Act perspective, anything that would send a signal to people contemplating coming to Windsor to start this over again, I thought from my chair was extremely helpful to send a signal. You had the city declared an emergency, the province declared an emergency, and then the federal government declared an emergency. And I think that ought to have sent a signal to a lot of people that this is a serious matter and will not be allowed to happen again.
Now, on that point, the city of Windsor actually declared a municipal state of emergency after the province did. Is that right?
Correct.
And it was on, I believe, on the 14th. Is that right?
That's correct.
So maybe just explain why the municipal state of emergency was called after the blockade had already been cleared and not prior to that.
Yes, thank you for asking that question. And so what happened is we had a council meeting prior to me signing off on the declaration of emergency on the 14th. One of the concerns that council had generally was there was a portion of the resolution in front of council that provided wide latitude to the city manager to do a number of things that council didn't feel comfortable giving sort of carte blanche to the city manager at that particular time. And we're talking about acquiring resources, moving transit routes, like the city operational type stuff. That I said, well, don't worry. If you have a concern with that, let's not get held up with that. I'll declare the emergency, which then would wrap that authority up to me, and anything that's required with respect to dealing with this direct pipeline that's been created, I'll have the ability to deal with. And so I signed it on the 14th, and I ended it 10 days later. And
Right.
so that allowed us and I don't even think there was much that came out of that in terms of, needing to be dealt with operationally. Everyone just sort of figured it out, and we did what we had to do. I think I may have given free transit to people who started on the west side of Huron Church to be able to get to the other side, because the disruption was big. There were a few things like that, but nothing material, I would say, was done by me with respect to that emergency power.
Right. And as you had mentioned, the injunction was really a signal to the public that the city was doing everything it could. Why couldn't the state of emergency also be a signal, even if measures wouldn't necessarily be used or there wasn't much additional powers that could be gained from it? Wouldn't it be a signal to the public that the city was doing everything it could?
Do you mean, why didn't I sign a declaration of emergency prior to the 14th?
Yes.
Well, I felt like that wasn't going to provide anything new that I needed at the time. So we didn't have, like, police were telling me what they needed. I was trying to amplify their requests from a city perspective with respect to public works and Jersey barriers and all the things that we had to mobilize. No one came to me saying, we can't do this, or they're charging us 10 times the amount. Nothing would have benefited. I can't see the situation becoming better because I signed it at that particular time. What happened on the 14th, though, when everyone woke up and they saw this tunnel from the 401 to the Ambassador Bridge in both directions, if you live in Windsor, you know that was like a major thing. All cross traffic was blocked. Bus routes were rerouted. There were going to be impacts on business. Many businesses, over 200 businesses that were, impacted as a result of that particular action. And again, that wasn't something that was my decision. That was a police decision to put these Jersey barriers in place and create a safe pipeline to and from the bridge. And so I anticipated that there would be some requirement to deal very, very quickly on the municipal side with the stuff that we deal with operationally, that tool would have given me the benefit of acting quickly. And so that's why I did it on the 14th as opposed to doing it earlier, because I didn't see the need to do it earlier.
And so the purpose then was to get some sort of financial compensation for the businesses that were prevented from getting business because of the Jersey barriers that were blocking east-west traffic?
I just knew, not necessarily. I knew that what had been done was going to have some form of material impact on a variety of different operations and businesses, a material impact on the way people live their lives on either side of Huron Church Road. And what I wanted, it wasn't so much at that time sending a signal to the public, it was just saying, okay, council, if you feel uncomfortable giving the city manager that authority, I'll take that authority under the Emergencies Act and be able to deal with anything very, very quickly. And again, in 10 days, once the situation stabilized and normalized, I signed off and said there's no longer a municipal emergency.
And how long were those Jersey barriers in place along Huron Church Road?
Weeks. Several weeks. I can't remember the exact date when they were finally removed. There was an incremental, for a couple of weeks they were there, and it was a direct pipeline, and you had hundreds of police on duty making sure that if trucks stopped, that they were acting very quickly to have folks move on. But incrementally and over time, you saw certain Jersey barriers removed at certain intersections so people could cross here on Church Road. And then police maintained I would say a heightened state of readiness at those locations, just in case there was a flare-up.
And what was your understanding of the potential of another blockade taking hold after the original one was cleared?
This is the important point, again, that there was the thought, and the chief expressed this to me, and Deputy Chief Belair at the time expressed to me, that they were quite concerned that something would happen. that there would be behavior where folks would come back, and they didn't know when, they didn't know how many, and there were police resources deployed along the 401 outside of the city of Windsor to sort of monitor this type of activity. There were resources allocated to scan social media and some of the likely sites to sort of gather intelligence on that front as well. But the thought was that they were coming back, and there were some attempts. There were some attempts that police intercepted, as I'm aware of.
And my understanding is that there was also the concern that once Ottawa was cleared, that those protesters would come to Windsor.
Correct.
And what can you tell us about that?
Again, just monitoring what was happening up in Ottawa, knowing that there was a high level of frustration amongst that protester group, that, if they were looking to continue that type of protesting activity, it's one thing to do it in Ottawa at the seat of the federal government. It's another thing to do it at the busiest border crossing between our two countries that has a significant impact on the lives of tens of thousands of Canadians, not just people in my community, people all across this province that rely on smooth and efficient border crossings for their livelihoods, who've been impacted, over a couple of years with the pandemic. And so, I think we all knew that if you wanted to have the biggest impact economically would be in Windsor, leading up to the Ambassador Bridge.
And if I can take you to WIN 50972. Now, this is February 16, so a few days after the blockade has been cleared. And this is a briefing. I believe these were some remarks that you gave. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And if you go down, keep going. So there, the bolded section there, you say, let me be clear, this remains a national security situation that prevents us from simply reopening Huron Church Road to regular traffic at this time. What did you mean by national security situation?
Well, I would add even national, economic security situation. The amount of trade that crosses at the Ambassador Bridge is material. It's material for our province, material for our nation. And so every day that bridge is closed, it has a huge impact on the lives of tens of thousands of Canadians who rely on smooth and efficient border crossings for their livelihoods. And so national security situation, we had the deployment of 3 kilometers of Jersey barriers in each direction. I didn't make that decision. That was a police decision using the intelligence that they had and all the tools and information they had at their disposal in order to find the best way forward to get access to the Ambassador Bridge from the 401 so that this bridge was open, that the economy was moving once again, and that they could maintain control of what I would argue is a piece of infrastructure that is in our national economic interest. It is a very material, critical piece of national infrastructure that just happens to be owned by a private interest.
Did you have any discussions with Minister Mendicino or anybody else at the federal government about the risk of another blockade after the one on the 14th was cleared?
I probably did. There were check-ins. Minister Mendicino was very good at checking in, saying, how are things going today? He did that many days in a row. And to the extent I had information from police where there was something worth reporting, I sent that back to him so that he had situational awareness of what we were dealing with on the ground. Minister Mendicino is someone he lived in Windsor. He went to law school at the University of Windsor, so he also knows the area. And once you have a perspective of what it's like on the ground, it's easier to have a conversation. He knows the impact of what happened on Huron Church Road without me even having to discuss it with him. He just intuitively knows that because he had experience in the area. And so, yeah, we went back and forth, and he was very good at checking in, just asking for an update and trying to gather information for his perspective.
So in terms of continuing threats to the Ambassador Bridge, you're getting that information from the chief of police or the deputy chief of police. You're not getting any information from any federal entities giving you kind of intelligence or information.
That's correct.
And to your knowledge, were any of the federal emergency powers ever used to prevent further blockades?
I'm not aware.
Now, on March 17, you wrote to Ministers Mendicino and Blair and to the Solicitor General explaining some issues that you believed had been brought to light by these blockades. Do you recall that?
Was this the letter asking to have a sit down and try and figure out the path forward?
Yes.
Yes.
And so what were some of those concerns that you had at the time?
Well, the Ambassador Bridge in the city of Windsor is a unique circumstance. So you have, as I said, the Ambassador Bridge, the busiest commercial border crossing between the United States and Canada, which is privately owned, that sits at one end of a municipal roadway, and 3 kilometers on the other end is a provincial highway. And so, the 401 is a roadway where there are no traffic lights. It's sort of barrier free. But as soon as you get off onto Huron Church Road, you're on that municipal road, which falls under the responsibility and authority of the city of Windsor and the Windsor Police Service. You have 6 or 7 traffic lights. So trucks, as they make their way from the 401 to the Ambassador Bridge, have to go through those series of municipal traffic lights. And it is a unique situation that you have, a provincial highway at one end, a municipal roadway linking what I would suggest is sort of important federal infrastructure. And so my request to them, to the other levels of government, was we need to sit down and figure this out. We need to figure out, in the event that something like this were to happen again, how do we respond and sort of pull the template off the shelf, that the response is seamless, that it's not a day or two here trying to figure out how many folks we need and who's going to do what and who should take the lead, and then ultimately who's paying for it. So the city of Windsor has carried all of the water. We're paying all of the bills, $5.3 million for the execution of this particular police action, which was absolutely necessary. But I would submit is completely unfair that the city of Windsor is shouldering those costs. It was not a typical municipal policing matter. In fact, it was a national economic emergency. And we responded appropriately. The Windsor Police did a great job. The OPP did a great job. The RCMP, they all worked very well together. But we need to figure this out moving forward, because the Ambassador Bridge is not going away, our municipal road's not going away, and the 401 is not going away. So what does this look like in the future? And that was my request to them, is to sit down and try and figure out how we do this together in the future to eliminate any sort of delays that might be inherent in the way we moved in February.
And have you had any response back?
No.
So can you give us a sense for the impact of the blockade, specifically on the auto sector in Windsor?
Well, it was, almost immediate. Again, within the first hour, our largest employer called saying, what's going on? The very next day, on February the 8th, they suspended some of their manufacturing operations, and it was intermittent during the week of the blockade. We also had parts suppliers that basically stopped producing parts because they had nowhere to send them, and they don't stockpile large quantity of parts. There was a huge impact in the auto sector. But don't forget, even in Essex County, City of Windsor is plus or minus 230,000 people. If we take the neighboring county, and we're part of that county, just not part of their government, it's about 450,000 people total in that area. We have the largest greenhouse operation in North America, second in the world next to Holland. And so a full 80% of all greenhouses in Canada are in Essex County. And so the produce that is produced in those facilities that operate 24/7, 365, the vast majority of it is exported to the United States through the Ambassador Bridge. And so the regional impact, which we cannot discount, was material. It was major. Having folks idled, having plants idled is not good just for our economy. It also had an impact on the US side because of the integration of our supply chains. And so that's why we had folks from the United States, senior leaders in the United States calling for an end to this as well and trying to push for a resolution because it was impacting their economy too.
And what discussions did you have then with counterparts or others in the U.S.?
I spoke with folks at Homeland Security, but more from an operational perspective at the bridge, so the port director at the bridge. And I spoke with the mayor of Detroit, once during the blockade, just to sort of, touch base, because I was getting a lot of media questions about whether I'd spoken to the mayor of Detroit, and I knew there really wasn't a whole lot that he could do, but I wanted to touch base with him. So, we were trying to resolve this situation. There wasn't a lot that I think could be provided from the U.S. At one point, we did have an overture from the governor of Michigan's office to provide tow trucks. I think she made a comment to the media, and then folks brought that to our attention. And when we reached out and had a conversation with her chief of staff, it really wasn't that the state of Michigan had tow trucks. They just offered to facilitate an introduction to tow truck companies that may be able to provide the support.
I see. Any other discussions with U.S. folks?
No.
Okay. So I want to take you to WIN 401628. And these are remarks that you gave. Now we're going back in time on February 9. But you said at the bottom of, the top of page 2, you said, if Canada becomes known as a difficult jurisdiction to do business with, to move goods in and out, for example, then supply chains will evolve and reconfigure to remove this element of risk and avoid Windsor, Essex. What were you basing that information on? Well,
I think everyone is aware now, so I can contextualize this a little differently than I could at the time. Everyone is aware now that the city of Windsor was successful in landing a $5 billion investment from LG, a joint venture from LG and Stellantis. And so they're building the first Canadian electric vehicle battery manufacturing facility in the city of Windsor. All of that discussion, all of that work, and the pre-planning was well underway during the protest in February. It just hadn't been announced publicly. And so, in fact, the CEO of Stellantis Global went to Canada during this time to have a meeting with senior officials. And so this was me sending a signal to the extent that any of those folks were watching, that we understand that this has to end, that we understand that you have a choice in terms of where you locate these facilities, and that we're doing all we can to try and move folks on. And that sort of plays into the whole injunction piece as well, that it's the public facing part of it that was important, as was it important to make sure police had another tool that they could use. But I wanted to make sure that with respect to the folks, early on here, we're in the very early part of sort of rolling out all of the pieces back in February for this major investment. I wanted to make sure that they knew very clearly that we were taking the situation very seriously and applying all resources that we could from a municipal perspective to get this situation resolved, reflecting on the fact that, did I think that the first Ford factory in Canada, 1904, I did